then hopefully there will be time for questions. Part 1, spiraling. I'll start by acknowledging that we're on the ancestral unceded land of the Clackamas, Chinook, Cowlitz, and other indigenous peoples. This acknowledgement, I'm going to interrupt myself. The images are sort of a parallel narrative. So they're going to kind of like follow along and also sometimes diverge. So, yeah. This acknowledgement is actually part of the central axis of this talk around which we will spiral. I'm inviting us to consider who we are, which also means considering why we are who we are and what we are doing, making, thinking, and feeling. None of these questions can be considered without also considering how, by whom, and according to what principles the ecotone of here and now was shaped. For me, these spatially, temporally, and philosophically vast questions prompt microscopic examination. We'll soon be zooming out to try to see our entire contemporary planetary system, but I want to start by zooming in. I want to look at that word land, embedded in the phrase, we are on the ancestral unceded land. The French Abenaki poet Cheryl Savageau writes about her understanding of land via the word akwangon. She writes, akwangon is from the Abenaki word for land, aki, and our basic concept of continual process, wangon. Akwangon is the continual becoming of the land, and we people as part of the ongoingness. Land for us includes not only the geographic place, but also all the non-human and human people who make up that particular place, including both those things Western culture sees as alive, such as plants and animals, and those things that they generally don't see as alive, such as stone, mountains, rivers, lakes, clouds. Land is a word of intimate relationship. Akwangon acknowledges the land as a process of becoming, in which everything has personhood. Our participation in Akwangon means first that we listen, that we pay attention with all of our senses, with our bodies, spirits, and our intellect to what is happening, what is becoming now at this moment. If we are disciplined and lucky, this attention can sometimes result in reciproesis, which is our doing in response to listening. And what about the attention itself? Poet Annalena Phillips Bell defines attention as a challenging form of directed mental, physical, and spiritual awareness, listening, observation, also care, attending to a place, time, system, being, consistently threatened or thwarted by various forms of distraction, devices, tasks, as well as by emotional reactions, including guilt and fear. Land, akwangon, reciproesis, listening, attention, shards of language, all. As writers, language is our material, the stuff from which we make. Just as paint is the painter's material, or air, sunlight, and water are the tree's materials. Weirdly, language is also the same material that we use to order a latte, or call for the dog's attention, or communicate with a clerk at the DMV. It is thoroughly utilitarian while also being, in the words of poet Danielle Vogel, and we heard this quote from Jay as well, a communal lung that holds and remembers all things through us, a neural interconnectivity, an extended nervous system that we all share. In considering those big questions of the here and now, I've been spiraling, zooming into the 4 small letters of the word land, zooming out to the prolonged reciprocal engagement with land as intimate relationship, veering to the vast infinite processes of land as ongoingness, becomingness, zooming into the intimacy of land as a way to listen, looping to the intimacy of listening as a precursor to doing or making, and the specificity of listening as a form of attention, and attention as a form of care, and care is something that we are all inevitably inside of, an enormous something, since we are all inside of the communal lung, the extended nervous system. This spiraling motion, moving swiftly and smoothly in and out of vastly different scales of space and time, is what happens to me when I really consider the present, the ecotone of here and now. And yes, I get a bit seasick, and yes, I see stars. But the movement is necessary, since an ecotone is never stable, is never an object, is always a process. It cannot be seen by standing still. It does not stake any claim in the myth of objectivity. It believes one can't be neutral on a moving train. Scientifically, an ecotone is a transition zone between two adjacent ecological communities, containing the characteristics of each. A classic example is where a forest and a meadow begins, a forest ends and a meadow begins, or where a river meets the ocean. The ecological borderland therein is rich and ever-changing. An ecotone is also a place of deep time and mystery. An ecotone is a portal. An ecotone embodies change. Every moment, the here and now, is an ecotone of overlapping consciousnesses and conditions. An ecotone is a meeting ground. Quicksand, glances across the bar, storm clouds, vacant lots, subway tunnels, sidewalks, traffic jams, all ecotones. Ecotones are estuarine, never fully mixing, never fully resolving, remaining distinct and unified at once. Part 2, naming. We, all of us alive on this planet now, are in an unprecedented ecotone of the here and now, sometimes called the Anthropocene, or called the Capitalocene, Plantationocene, Misanthropocene. The names for this idea are myriad because none of the names really fully work. I'll talk more about the problem of naming in a moment. For now, I'll start with a basic thesis of the Anthropocene, which is that we are currently in, and have been for some time, a new geological epoch dominated by human activity. The Anthropocene is the human epoch, a new epoch of geological time in which human activity is exerting such a powerful influence on the planet that we will leave a lasting signature in the strata record. In other words, human activity is changing the actual composition of the planet. The term Anthropocene began as a scientific term before it made its way to the artists and philosophers and activists. It was introduced by atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen and biologist Eugene Stormer in 2000, who proposed that the previous geological epoch, the Holocene, which was characterized by 12,000 years of stable climate, had been destabilized by carbon dioxide emissions, sea level rise, mass extinction of species, mass domestication of animals, plastic pollution, deforestation, and other things that our culture tends to collectively and uncritically refer to as progress or development. According to the Anthropocene hypothesis, the Earth is now a totally human-dominated system, which means that the notion of nature as a thing that exists apart from human intervention no longer exists. A key component of the Anthropocene is what Rob Nixon calls slow violence, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. In this way, for those of us living in wealthy nations, the harshest realities of the Anthropocene are often difficult to see directly. They are there, but hidden inside everything, just out of view. Take, for example, the seemingly innocuous object that is your handout. This paper was made from trees. These trees were either grown on a monoculture tree farm that used to be a biodiverse forest, host to literally millions of species that lost their homes, suffered, and eventually perished when the forest was cut, or it was made from trees taken from an existing biodiverse forest that is on its way to being a monoculture tree farm. This monoculture tree farm is what is called a sacrifice zone, a place that has been permanently impaired by environmental damage or economic disinvestment. These zones read like a map of who is culturally valued and who is not. Sacrifice zones reflect not just our cultural willingness to sacrifice other than human species, but also to disregard the lives of the humans living in those places. In Naomi Klein's words, you can't have a system built on sacrificial places and sacrificial people unless intellectual theories that justify their sacrifice exist and persist. From manifest destiny to terra nullius to Orientalism, from backward hillbillies to backward Indians, end quote. And these racist, classist, ecologically devastating sacrifice zones are official government policy. As recently as the 1970s, scientists advising the US government openly referred to certain parts of the country as, quote, national sacrifice areas. The terminology is no longer openly used, but the practice decidedly persists. So this paper on which your handout is printed, to say nothing of the petroleum-based ink, has hidden within it a great deal of slow violence, which, unless we choose to, we have the privilege to simply not see. The Anthropocene is hiding in plain sight. In addition to its chameleonic capacity to disappear, as a hypothesis, which the Anthropocene is a hypothesis, there are still some big debates about it. One of the biggest questions is when the epoch began. For some scientists and philosophers, the Anthropocene commenced around 10,000 BC with the invention of agriculture. For others, it began in 1789 with the invention of the steam engine, signaling the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Others think it began in 1415 or 1492 with the advent of colonialism, signaling the forced imposition of Eurocentric ideologies of domination. And still others posit that the detonation of the first nuclear bomb in 1945 is its beginning, an event that signaled entry into the Great Acceleration, when massive increases occurred in human population, carbon emissions, species extinctions, and the production and discard of metals, concrete, and plastics. These proposed milestones for the beginning of the Anthropocene should offer a clue as to the shortcomings of the term. What do all of these milestones have in common? They are all moments in which white supremacist Western ideologies assume forceful domination over indigenous and non-Western cultures. Anthropos is ancient Greek for man or human being. Etymologically, the term's root secures the concept of generalized human activities that are ostensibly responsible for this new geological epoch, positing that the entire human species is equally responsible for and impacted by the damage done to our planet, which simply is not true. We are not all in the Anthropocene together. As slow violence and sacrifice zones make clear, the global poor and the dispossessed are generally in it far more than others. Those of us in wealthy, colonialist, consumerist societies bear far more responsibility for the creation and perpetuation of the Anthropocene, but feel its effects, at least for now, far less acutely. The premise embedded in the term Anthropocene of an all-inclusive anthropos is not just inaccurate, but violent. Moreover, even citizens of the wealthiest nations bear far less responsibility for the conditions leading to the Anthropocene than corporations and other associated neoliberal structures such as governments and militaries. In the words of cultural critic T.J. Demos, the activities attributed to causing the Anthropocene are hardly human, at least in that generalizing species being sense, but are in fact mostly the activities of corporate industry. The Anthropocene rhetoric frequently acts as a mechanism of universalization, which enables the military state corporate apparatus to disavow responsibility for the differentiated impacts of climate change, making us all complicit in its destructive project. This disavowal and obfuscation overshadows the crucial fact that, as Indigenous scholar Jessica L. Horton has written, the specter of human-wide culpability for climate change is produced in white public space. The map of climate-related suffering and other environmental injustices follows the well-worn grooves of European colonization. In addition to masking the violence of neoliberalism, colonialism, and racism, this generalized anthropos, in the words of poet Heidi Lynn Staples, implies that the lack of a parasitic relationship to our living earth is, in fact, non-human. In other words, this term tells us that the only way to be human is to be in conflict with ourselves, our larger body, our planet. In this way, the term Anthropocene is, according to its critics, colonialist, neoliberal, racist, and supports a view of humanity that is essentially nihilistic. The term ultimately inflicts the same violence that it purports to critique. It matters what you call a thing, wrote Solmaz Sharif. It does, it matters. So what to call this ecotone of here and now? I tend not to use the term Anthropocene for reasons I've hopefully made extensively clear. I tend to prefer the term Capitalocene, which points a finger squarely at the capitalist system that is responsible for the damage, capitalist fundamentalism, and all its associated violence. I also prefer the term Misanthropocene, which upends the insidious notion that humans are simply bound to be destructive and profoundly selfish. Misanthropocene instead suggests that on a societal level, we are acting not in the manner of anthropos, but rather in the manner of misanthropos. We're acting out our very worst impulses, which means that if we individually and collectively make better choices, things can potentially change. Both of these terms also have their pitfalls, but I won't get into that in the interest of time. And it matters what you call a thing, and language is a communal lung, an extended nervous system in which we all reside. It matters what we call a thing because language is our material, because what we call a thing constitutes that thing. We become what we say we are. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to continue to use the phrase, the ecotone of here and now, to describe what is often referred to as the Anthropocene. I like the music of the phrase, which happens to be perfectly iambic. I also like its ambiguity, its openness. It is, to me, to reference Jay's talk, open language. Part 3, perceiving. We do not have a good word for the ecotone of here and now, partly because it is exceedingly difficult to perceive the ecotone of here and now, and therefore exceedingly difficult to understand it. For one thing, we are in it, and it's a challenge to know a thing while being immersed in it. We are inextricable from our circumstances. But it's also that the complexity and temporal scale of our unique moment might actually surpass our capacity to understand it. In the words of Roy Scranton, climate change, which is one of the defining characteristics of the ecotone of here and now, is hard to think about because it's cognitively almost impossible to keep in mind the intricate relationships that tie together an oil well in Venezuela, Siberian permafrost, Saudi F-15s bombing a Yemeni wedding, subsidence along the Jersey Shore, albedo effect near Kangaroo-Suak, the Pacific decadal oscillation, the polar vortex, shampoo, California cattle, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, leukemia, plastic paper, the sixth extinction, Zika, and the basic decisions we make every day. Yes, it's mind-bendingly difficult to connect the dots. In other words, the ecotone of here and now is, to use philosopher Timothy Morton's term, a set of hyperobjects. Hyperobjects are, in Morton's words, things that you can study and think about and compute, but that are not so easy to see directly. Things like not just a styrofoam cup or two, but all the styrofoam on Earth ever. Hyperobjects outlast me and they outscale me. Not just one speck of plutonium, but all the plutonium we've ever made ever. There are so many things in our present moment that are hyperobjects. Climate change is a big one. Genetically modified substances, petroleum products, and plastic are a few examples that we all likely encounter on a daily basis. These are objects shot through with slow violence that, in aggregate, are fundamentally impossible for us to fully understand. They cannot ultimately be fully known through human senses because the temporal and spatial scale at which they exist occurs beyond the scope of human perception. What happens when we are confronted with a hyperobject, or to use Martha Reed's extension of the term, a hyperobjective system? What happens if we attempt to fully perceive such things, if we attempt, in poet Brenda Hillman's words, to hear on conflicting levels? Daisy Hildyard thinks we split into two bodies. Hildyard thinks that the hyperobject of climate change creates two distinct bodies for every human. The body that we live in every day, moving around, doing our daily tasks, and a second body that is global truth. This second body is everywhere at once. It is global and simultaneous, impacting all life everywhere. Your second body has a relationship with and a responsibility to an American barn owl, a Zimbabwean hippopotamus, and a Norwegian reindeer, car bombs going off in Baghdad, a teenager in Kolkata missing a thumb. She goes on, this second body is your own literal and physical biological experience. It is a version of you. It is not a concept. It is your own body. This second body involves boundarylessness, creating a loss of a sense of individuality, which can be both freeing and terrifying. Consider this, in this moment, this afternoon post-lunch, sleepy, overwhelmed, tired moment. Are you fully and totally here now in your body? Is there a part of you that is perhaps dispersed? Is there a part of you that is present in a place or a time far removed, engaged in some variety of global truth, whatever that means to you? This might take the form of a feeling of worry or fear or hope or distraction. It might be focused on a distant person or place or species, or it might be a very generalized feeling of dispersal. Life is not just networked, it is network. The objects that pass through our lives, the things we throw away, the nearly infinite forces and things we benefit from and are privileged or ignorant enough to not think about, they are all still totally real, if beyond our comprehension. With Hildyard's help, I see my second body. It is a chaotic, ever-shifting mass of stuff, congealing into a petroleum-slicked, me-shaped mass that is constantly globally materializing and dematerializing according to a hyper-objective logic that I can't quite track, but that is sensical on a scale beyond my comprehension. The me-shaped mass has muscles, tendons, ligaments, bones. She has organs with which to sense and process and think. She extends an arm, then a finger. She points, and I think she is pointing at me. Part 4, hinging. So what's a writer to do with that? How to not drown in shame, fear, or any of its many corollaries? I don't know. And I'm not sure anyone knows, but I find myself looking to artists and writers who are experimenting with the question. I look to writers whose work occupies an expanded field of possibilities, who privilege the universe of terms that are felt to be in opposition within a cultural situation over any allegiance to history. I look to writers whose work is attentive to organism, not decorum. In other words, I look to writers who are experimenting. In the words of poet Myung-Mi Kim, to experiment is to register, notice, discern the necrotizing effect of cultural norms motivated and maintained by ideologies of monolingualism, pathologizing of difference, and capitalist will. To experiment is to tend poesis. In other words, to experiment is to question the construction of language itself. There is an intrinsic link between diminishing biodiversity and diminishing language diversity. High prestige languages perpetuate a hegemonic agenda. Infrastructures of dominance consolidate and regiment the primacy of fluency, legibility, and readability. Experimental writers push back on this deadening of language and culture by making visible the habituated, codified, acculturated, and their normalizing function. Experimental writers render restrictive ideologies visible in order to know where to aim the hammer, the suture, the glitter, the outstretched hand. The writers I find myself turning to in the infinite complexity of the ecotone of here and now are trying to embrace ideas and feelings that are fundamentally beyond comprehension. These writers are trying to use language to alter language. Some are betting on the possibility that innovative poetics might even constitute a type of ethics. And they are mostly knowingly setting themselves up for failure. They fail beautifully over and over in more and more complex and daring and humble ways. Their capacity to fail is in direct relationship with their capacity to potentially know, to potentially feel. So I'm going to talk about the Brenda Hillman poem a little, which is in your handout. Brenda Hillman's At the Solstice, a Yellow Fragment uses compressed and fragmentary diction as a means to experiment with representing the multiplicitous consciousness and the massive complexity of the ecotone of here and now. Hillman's diction embodies the complex bodily duality described by Hildegard. Her fragmentary diction is the necessarily fragmented language of our ecotone, zooming from proper nouns of corporations to onomatopoetic sounds, from the deep time of tablets or chanterelles to the anxiety-laden mundanity of the White House comment line. In Hildegard's words, climate change creates a new language in which you have to be all over the place. You are always all over the place. Hillman is all over the place in this poem, which is to say that her fragments operate like our contemporary bodies, existing in multiple ways and places at once. Each fragment establishes a complex relationship with all the other fragments in the poem through proximity. This poem is a fragmented, fractured world in which the diction is not unified or self-contained because it cannot be unified or self-contained in order to discuss what it is discussing. Hillman's fragmented diction creates a world primarily of interconnected forces and perceptions, a world of movement, transition, and multiplicity, rather than a grounded, knowable world of objects. Her varied, fragmented, imaginative stances rise from the mind's propensity and/or the second body's propensity to inhabit multiple spaces at once, and the necessity of this propensity for us to have any hope of honestly encountering our current world. Of this poem, she wrote, "This poem came from the unhinged state of mind of late autumn as solstice approaches. As always, environmental crises were much on my mind. Contemplating the non-human species in the spirit world allowed lines to emerge in fast succession, and the layered tone came from trying to hear on conflicting levels." Hillman characterizes her state of mind as unhinged. What does it mean to be hinged in this ecotone? Is it the same as being unhinged? Poet C.A. Conrad said, "We're living at this hinge of history that is startling. Being in a hinge is a lot like being in an ecotone." A hinge yokes two things together while simultaneously allowing them to swing apart. It keeps them both distinct and united. A hinge is defined as a jointed or flexible device on which a door, lid, or other swinging part turns, or a flexible ligamentous joint, or a small piece of thin gum paper used in fastening a postage stamp in an album, or a determining factor, a turning point. This last definition is also the oldest, deepest, rootest meaning, which arose circa 1300 from the German Heng, which meant the axis of the earth. Its application to a door, that much smaller movable thing, didn't arise until a century later. Here we are in this ecotone of here and now, this hinge of history, this moving axis of the earth, this screen door swinging and banging, singing a circular song in the summer night wind. Here we are startled, according to Conrad, Startled because, as Camille Dungy has written, our future holds fewer bats, fewer beavers, fewer bees, fewer Micronesian kingfishers, fewer languages that might describe the world in different words than those favored by the word brokers of the Capitalocene. Fewer eyeless shrimp, fewer unpolluted catfish, fewer humans whose lives are not compromised by warfare and its legacies. Fewer banana trees, less cedar, less eucalyptus, fewer pecan groves, fewer children whose lives are not diminished by dependence on ruthless resource extraction. Fewer elephants, fewer sharks, fewer whales, fewer families with access to potable water. The loss is overwhelming sometimes. One of the ways one might describe this overwhelming loss is the global condition of being born into a world that no longer exists. We aren't in the world we somehow expect to be in. Or, in the words of poet Claire Wamenholm, we have known since we were children how the world is a wounded thing that cannot be said aloud. In 2003, the anthropologist Glenn Albrecht created the term Solastalgia to try to name this culturally metastasizing feeling, which he described as the homesickness felt when you are at home, in your homeland, but your home has been altered by processes outside of your control. Your home, that most familiar of places, feels terribly unfamiliar. It is at once your home and not at all your home. Your home has become a startling hinge, yoking the deeply familiar with the deeply disturbed and disturbing. The loss is overwhelming sometimes. It cannot be said aloud. The world we expected no longer exists. This is true. It is also true, in the words of Dungy, that language is how we shape our imagination. Language is how we reach toward empathy. Language is resilience, a means of pushing back on the nihilism. C.A. Conrad's work exemplifies this sort of reaching toward empathy through language. Their current work is focused on vibrational absence. When a species becomes extinct, they take their sounds with them: song, cry, breath, footfall, heartbeat. And we in turn replace their sounds with our human sounds, our metal, machines, bombs, cars, etc. When I was born over half a century ago, my cells were formed on a more complex organic vibration than the cells of children being born today. This thinking led Conrad to create Resurrect Extinct Vibration, which is one of their somatic poetry rituals. They began creating these rituals as a way to nurture their capacity for absolute attention, a way to resist a production line approach to art making. The rituals vary widely, but all necessitate being in the extreme present. During the rituals, they take extensive notes. These notes provide the basis for new poems. They describe Resurrect Extinct Vibration as inducing a trance by saturating my body with recordings of recently extinct animals while lying on the ground across the US. They then write from these sounds and from the places in which they are hearing the sounds, which is often a big box store. Walmart is one of their favorites. They write from a charged ecotone of sounds, the din of late capitalism mixed with the buzzing, fluttering, humming, clicking, and howling of ghosts. Conrad writes from the presence of absence. Conrad's Resurrect Extinct Vibration ritual can be connected to the work of acoustomologist Stephen Feld, who studied the anthropology of sound. Feld lived for several years in the 1970s with the Kaluli people in a remote part of Papua New Guinea, where he documented the Kaluli's understanding of place through sound. He found that the funerary weeping and ceremonial songs of the Kaluli were sung in the voices of birds, and that the Kaluli understood the birds as echoes of the spirit world. In his words, birds are not just birds, they are anemama, or gone reverberations. The voices of the birds are the vanished voices of the dead, an absence transformed into a presence, or a presence that renders an absence audible. For the Kaluli, a bird's voice exists on those multiple unhinged hinging planes. It's the bird's distinct voice, while also containing inside and underneath the gone reverberation, the voice of the dead, the voice of memory, a living map of a tangled, vibrant, deep time world. This world aligns with the Indigenous artist and activist Jimmy Durham's conception of the difference between Western and Indigenous epistemologies. He wrote, "Western society is divided in non-connecting squares. Each square represents an idea of human activity or knowledge. When new things come into our circle in Indigenous epistemology, it expands. When new things come into Western society, another square is added. A gone reverberation is an expanding circle, a rippling into and out. In its depth, expansiveness, and multiplicity, a gone reverberation is kin to Hillman and Conrad's all over the place language, an embodiment of the unknowable ecotone of here and now, a multivalent echo map of absence and presence in deep time and place." Part 5, Thirsting. For many years, I've had these words, written by Antonio Machado in his long poem, Proverbs and Songs, on my studio wall. I painted it on an old scrap of sheet many years ago. The words have served as a constant reminder to me to keep making things, even when the endeavor felt pointless or even destructive. Dices que nada se crea, alfarero a tus cacharros, haz tu copa y no te importe si no puedes hacer barro. You say that nothing is created, potter to your pottery, make your cup and don't worry if you can't make clay. I've carried this scrap of old sheet with me for many years, across many state and national lines and through drastic life changes. I recently reread the poem and was struck by this stanza, which precedes the one that I felt compelled to paint so many years ago. Dices que nada se crea, no te importe, con el barro de la tierra haz una copa para que beba tu hermano. You say nothing is created, don't worry about it. With the clay of the earth, make a cup from which your brother can drink. At this point in my life, in this ecotone of here and now, this seems like an important addition to my long-beloved stanza, because it's not just about the act of making, it's about making something to share, something that might inform or sustain or inspire another, be a cup from which to drink. It is an embodiment of the idea of language as a way to shape our imagination, language as a way to reach toward empathy. Later in the poem, Machado writes, "Bueno es saber que los vasos no sirven para beber. Lo malo es que no sabemos para qué sirve la sed." It is good to know that glasses are useful to us for drinking. The trouble is that we don't know what thirst is good for. What is thirst good for? In this ecotone of here and now, we are startled, we are all over the place, we are thirsty, and will only get thirstier. What can we learn from thirsting? With some imagination, thirst can be a form of empathy with all who have ever thirsted. Thirst is a form of not knowing. It is challenging because we do not know for sure when the thirst will be slaked. In the words of poet Era D. Matthews, the feeling of uncertainty is universal, so I create an environment inside the text in which people become accustomed to uncertainty in some way, because that is, to me, the actual fabric of our lives, a sense of uncertainty. How comfortable can we be with the end of a journey that produces no yield in terms of certainty? Can we be comfortable with the not knowing? Can we be comfortable with our thirst? Can we bring our imaginations to it? Can we learn from it? Can we hear its distinct vibration of absence and presence combined? Often we cannot. our understandable reaction to the horrifying, terrifying information characteristic of the ecotone of here and now, to our thirst, is to down the first liquid in sight. Big gulp. Shut it out. Try to rationalize it or push it away. We all engage in some form of denial, usually what's known as interpretive or implicative denial, terms described by sociologist Stanley Cohen. With interpretive denial, facts are accepted, but their logical meaning is denied. So we might accept that climate change, for example, exists and is scary, but conclude that it's a purely technical energy problem or a market failure, making it something that scientists and economists need to figure out. The problem is interpreted in a way that neutralizes our capacity to engage with it. We are off the hook. The second type is the type that we probably mostly engage with, which is called implicative denial. The existence of the thing is accepted, but the psychological, political, or moral implications are denied. Yes, climate change exists, and yes, my choices contribute to the problem, but I'm a writer, not an activist. The problem's ethical implications are neutralized. It's what psychologist Kari Norgaard calls the social production of innocence. These forms of denial can result from a wide range of psychological stances. At one end of the spectrum is nihilism or apathy. We've all felt it. Why even try? At the other end of the spectrum is a paralysis that results from caring intensely but feeling paralyzed by the care. These are very different internal stories that can look the same externally. The hinge of our ecotone of here and now can silence us, shun our empathy, disallow grief, command us to consume the first thing we see in order to quench the thirst, stop feeling it now. We can't make the clay. We can't undo the facts. This is the clay we've received, and it's red with what might be blood. How can we feel our thirst but not succumb to it? How can we make a serviceable cup from our imperfect clay, use our words to allow ourselves, our loved ones, our communities to drink? Last part 6, unhinging. For several centuries, the dominant Western understanding of the human self has been guided by Descartes and his construction of a mind that is distinct from a body. In the Cartesian worldview, this disembodied mind is the marker of our very humanness. We are human because of our rational minds. Cartesian humans are ordered, objective, and boundaried. Cartesian humans are modular squares, not ever-shifting circles. Cartesian humans are not thirsty. Heidi Lynn Staples asserts that by creating a hegemony of dominion, this understanding of humanity is the root cause of the wicked problems that characterize our ecotone of here and now. She extends Judith Butler's paradigm of gender performativity to the idea of human performativity. Just as we are constantly receiving cultural messages to attempt to persuade us to performatively align our behavior with a false gender binary, so too are we constantly receiving cultural messages attempting to persuade us to performatively align our behavior with a false Cartesian understanding of the human. If we consider the human I to be performative, what story do you wish to perform? What character do you most want to play? And where shall you play? What costume? What mask? What, dear writer, are your lines? Perhaps we are not meant to answer these questions, but rather to remain thirsty in the not knowing, listening closely to the many conflicting responses that move through and inhabit us, never fully resolving into a singular performative role. A reimagination of the self is a political act. Can we reimagine the fragmentary self, the non-self, the solastalgic self, the dispersed self, the all-over-the-place self, the thirsty self, as permeable, mutable, and deeply receptive? Can we reimagine the creative self as a symbiotic fragment composed of billions of symbiotic fragments, living in a world that is a vast, fragmented symbiosis? What forms might our writing take if we allow ourselves to be unhinged and permeable enough to believe in such a radical, apparent thing? What forms might our writing take if we were to live and write within a field of interanimating tendencies in a geopathic world? If we were to actively greet the enigma while staying with the trouble? If we were to dream downward, to act horizontally? How might a body inhabited by poetry inhabit the land? How might a body inhabited by the continual, intimate becoming of the land inhabit poetry? I think of poet Hoa Nguyen's description of her writing practice. Reference materials include studies of rhizomes, weeds, and the practice of art as a mode of resistance with ethical responsibilities. This type of unhinged writing life is perhaps a new approach to an ethical artistic life in the vein of what has been called co-existentialism. This type of unhinged writing life's predominant capacity is to help describe the hinge, to tell what it feels like to live inside a living contradiction. Its capacities are descriptive and associational, not prescriptive. As such, it is rife with ambiguity and mismatch. Its goal is not rhetoric, but art. This type of unhinged writing life is never self-contained and never resolves into a product. It is a way of making that prioritizes interdependence with everyone and everything else. It is all over the place. This type of writing life prioritizes attention as a form of care, patiently listening for the right conditions to nurture reciproesis. This type of unhinged writing life is a way of being in an ecotone by being an ecotone, a way of touching the clay, making the cup. Thank you.